Thank you very much, Matt. Good afternoon, friends. Of course, it's wonderful to be back. Today is an anniversary. 65 years ago today, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson gave one of the most eloquent, important, lauded, and remembered speeches in history. He gave it in courtroom 600 in the Palace of Justice, Nuremberg. The date, July 26, 1946. At that point, Nuremberg was located in the U.S. occupation zone of Allied-occupied former Germany. Jackson was the United States Chief of Counsel for the prosecution of Axis war criminals in the European theater, the U.S. Chief Prosecutor at Nuremberg. And his speech, 65 years ago today, was his closing argument to the International Military Tribunal in the trial of the principal Nazi war criminals. But he was, of course, Justice Jackson. He was a U.S. Supreme Court justice, had been for 4 years at that point in his life, and his Nuremberg year was his 1 year away, AWOL is a fair way to describe it, performing a presidential assignment that he believed his skills, his citizenship, his interests, and the world required him to accept. He's remembered as perhaps the best writer in the history of the United States Supreme Court. He's remembered as an independent, candid, hard to pigeonhole, very hard to push around justice. And he was all of that already by 1945 when he went to Nuremberg, and by 1946 when he summed up at Nuremberg. But he originated here. He, of course, was a Pennsylvania native. He was a New York State lawyer. He was a Democrat. He was a friend of Franklin D. Roosevelt. He became a New Dealer. Thus, 75 years ago next month, we will hit another anniversary. That's the anniversary of Franklin Roosevelt delivering in the amphitheater the I Hate War speech with his being featured young Assistant Attorney General Robert Jackson seated in the second row over the president's shoulder. Now, the talk of a Supreme Court appointment for Robert Jackson had begun even by that summer of 1936, the summer of I Hate War. And it picked up and was even more pronounced the next year, the year of court packing, when there was much speculation that if Roosevelt succeeded in getting legislation that grew the court, one of his new appointees would be his fair-haired boy, if you will, Jackson. The talk continued as Jackson rose through the New Deal, and by late 1939, when Justice Pierce Butler of the U.S. Supreme Court died, there was very serious talk of appointing by then Solicitor General Jackson to the Supreme Court. Now, that appointment went to his boss, the Attorney General Frank Murphy, and Jackson ascended to that job, Attorney General, before going on to the Supreme Court. But one of the interesting things about late 1939, in my research, it's the first really pronounced moment of this, is that a Supreme Court vacancy leads to substantial advocacy by women for the appointment of a woman to the United States Supreme Court. 1939. Didn't happen. Frank Murphy happened. Jackson becomes Attorney General. A year later, he joins the court. And of course, that was an all-male court. But Jackson's world in its time was not an all-male world. It, of course, had a personal life. He had a wife, a helpmate, a marriage of almost 40 years. He had a daughter who was a brilliant woman and her father's real intellectual peer. He had a series of secretaries in the 1930s and the 1940s who were really glass ceiling victims. They were women who in later times would have gone to law school and become judges and Supreme Court shortlisters themselves in many cases. One was a British immigrant who worked for Jackson here in Jamestown, Miss Millicent Pike. She wrote in a very British style, and I assume spoke that way. He had a Department of Justice secretary in the SG's office, Grace Stewart, who interestingly did become a law student and then a lawyer and then a judge on the D.C. courts in the 1940s and 1950s. He had a Frewsburg and then Jamestown secretary who went to Washington to succeed her, Ruth Sternberg, and she worked for Jackson for about 7 years. He had a career secretary at the U.S. Supreme Court, Elsie Douglas. Each of them was in a sense, a professional peer, a partner in the law work of Jackson's world. And unique among the Nuremberg prosecutors, and I think the judges at Nuremberg, he was the one who had a senior female attorney as one of his principal advisors, a State Department lawyer named Catherine Fite. But Robert H. Jackson never had a female colleague who was truly a peer, never one who was a prod, a foil, or indeed a better. He had, in other words, no Sandra Day O'Connor, no Ruth Bader Ginsburg, no Sonia Sotomayor, no Elena Kagan, who was part of his professional and judicial experience. Thus, welcome to the modern world, as I welcome you to Chautauqua's 7th annual Robert H. Jackson Lecture on the Supreme Court of the United States. As Matt said, this has indeed become a real brand, a visible feather in Chautauqua's cap, particularly in the circles that it focuses on: the justices, the Supreme Court, its bar, its reporters, and others who are attentive watchers of the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Byron White, who served for 30-plus years from the 1960s to the early 1990s, had a line that is much quoted and I think much accepted as right. Every appointment of a Supreme Court justice creates a new court. Change one, and you've changed the body. Well, since last July, when Jeff Schessel was here delivering the 6th Jackson Lecture, we have a new Supreme Court because Justice Elena Kagan in August was appointed, confirmed, and succeeded Justice John Paul Stevens. And that new court, this new court, replaced the previous new court, which was created a year earlier when Justice Sotomayor replaced Justice Souter. That court also had a duration of only 1 year. And notice the notable characteristic of each of these two new courts, the current one and the previous one, in comparison to the court before that, which lived from 2006 to 2009. It was the court created when Justice Alito replaced Justice O'Connor. We are now back to a Supreme Court with multiple women justices. The court had, with Justice O'Connor's retirement, of course, only Justice Ginsburg. And then with Sotomayor, became a court again of 2 women. And with Kagan is now a court of 3 women. And someday will be a court of 4 women. And someday will be a court of 5 women. But turning to today's speaker, I have to say, in, of course, a couched way, put it in quotation marks, the Supreme Court does have currently a 4th woman. Yes, she's not on the bench, but in its life, and especially in its reaches, as it reaches its audiences, including the public, the citizenry, the attentive public, which means, yes, us, Chautauqua, it's got the voice and the pen of Dahlia Lithwick. She, a Canadian, has become, of course, thoroughly American and thoroughly the astute observer and voice describing what that branch of our government is up to. She's a graduate of Yale University and Stanford Law School. She practiced law and then became a journalist. I think the internet age has done many unexpected things, and sometimes it made journalists out of people who weren't really expecting to be journalists. And what Dahlia does on Slate, on NPR, on MSNBC, and Newsweek, and the other places where you've read her, heard her, and watched her, is combine 2 things that make her that 4th strong female voice, not on, but of the Supreme Court. She brilliantly tracks and describes and explains what they are up to. And given the media restrictions that they impose, we need people like her to do that. But she does it with an incredible style. It includes humor. It includes, I think, sass would be a fair word. It includes communicative effectiveness, which is, of course, what the Supreme Court is doing when it writes opinions. But I must say, in a lot of cases, their opinions do much, and her opinions do more. Thus, it's a true honor, on behalf of Chautauqua Institution and the Jackson Center, to welcome Dahlia Lithwick as the 7th annual Robert H. Jackson Lecturer on the Supreme Court of the United States. Her topic today is how women are changing the Supreme Court. Dahlia Lithwick.